I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers House in our Wexler studio by Erica Kaufman, poet, teacher, and teacher's teacher, whose books include Post Classic, Roof 2019, and Instant Classic, Roof 2013, and who was co-editor of No Gender Reflections on the Life and Work of Carrie Edwards, who's the director of the Bard College Institute for Writing and Thinking, and whose essay on Joan Retallack is part of a new book called The Difference is Spreading, 50 Contemporary Poets on 50 Poems, and who has published several other times substantively about Joan's work, including on Joan Retallack's memoir, Investigating the Experience of Experiencing, and by Simone White, whose books include Or on Being the Other Woman, Duked, 2022, Dear Angel of Death, Ugly Duckling, 2018, Of Being Dispersed, Future Poem, 2016, whose poetry and prose have appeared pretty much everywhere, including Art Forum, eFlux, Harper's, Bomb, the Chicago Review, the New York Review of Books, Harriet the Blog, whose honors include a 2021 Creative Capital Award, a 2017 Whiting Award in Poetry, and you just got another honor, Simone. Add that to the biography.
A Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grants to Artist Award.
Which is hot off the presses. Congratulations. And who I'm so happy to say is my colleague here at Penn and here at the Writers House, and who, in fact, this very semester is co-teaching the annual Kelly Writers House Fellow Seminar, the first of the three fellows for which is indeed the aforementioned Joan Retallack. And joined by, yes, indeed, we're also joined by the one and only Joan Retallack, whose many important, influential books include Procedural Elegies, Western Civ Continued, Memoir, The Poetical Wager, After Images, Errata Suite, How to Do Things with Word, Music Cage, and other works, and a book of 2020, Boshed, published by Litmus Press, and who on the very afternoon of our recording this episode of PoemTalk is completing her visit to us as a Kelly Writers House Fellow, indeed, which has entailed a long interanimated session with our students, a fabulous reading, which by the time this PoemTalk is released will be available in full at Joan's already vast Pen Sound page, and several days generally of marvelous, helpful, thought-filled vibe and spirit of collaboration and poetical conversation. Joan Retallack, thank you so much for hanging out with us these last 2 days.
You are most welcome.
It's really great to have you here. And Simone, pal, hi.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here again.
And Erica Kaufman, you came with Joan, and we're not letting you leave. Can you phone it in to Bard from now on?
I'd love to.
Oh, wait a minute. She's my ride back home.
Oh, that's a problem.
You can't.
Well, then you have to stay. I hope nobody from Bard is hearing this episode because they're going to wonder,
Let's make sure they don't.
I don't know how we can do that. But anyway, everybody takes all these things in the right spirit. And anyway, PoemTalk went on the road April 2022, actually March 30th or 31st, and we were at Bard.
You'll have to come back.
Wonderful. We'll come back. That's the plan. Well, today the four of us have gathered here to talk about Tina Darragh's Wire Boxes. She performed a version of this piece at a reading hosted by the Line Reading Series in New York in February 2001, and our colleague Kendall Owens transcribed the audio from that performance, and Joan then helped revise and format the transcription in part by consulting the second half of the poem as it appeared in Tina's book, My Hands to Mutant Solidarities, published by Dry Imager Press in 2020. Given the dates of the wire service stories, the news stories Tina cites, and the reference to the Seattle WTO protests of 1999, we can date the composition of the first part of the poem to that year. The second half of our poem had already appeared in the 1989 book Against the Odds under the title Letterboxes, and thanks to Erica Kaufman for locating that version. So here now is Tina Darragh performing Wire Boxes.
Wire Boxes. Interpress service, 10/5/99. Lead. Full-page ad in New York Times announces alliance of nearly 200 labor and environmental groups. Body. WTO dispute panel rules against U.S. law requiring all shrimp sold in the U.S. to be caught in nets with sea turtle escape devices, and challenges France's asbestos ban. Steelworkers and forest protection activists initially joined forces against Maxim Inc.'s clear cuts of ancient redwoods in Northern California and its 13-month lockout of Kaiser aluminum plants in Washington, Ohio, and Louisiana. Associated Press State and Local Wire, 11/24/99, PM cycle. Lead. Press conference at University of Washington introduces alliance members. Body. National Lawyers Guild promises to send legal observers to the demonstrations. Representatives from the following groups make statements: Ruckus, Global Exchange, Rainforest Action Network, Animal Welfare Institute, and the People's Global Action Caravan. Labor union presidents represent the AFL-CIO, Teamsters, Steelworkers, Machinists, and United Auto Workers. Associated Press State and Local Wire, 11/30/99, AM cycle. Lead. Downtown Seattle is a street bazaar of social issues with police and riot gear stationed at major intersections. Body. A 5 a.m. investigation of a bomb scare at the convention center curtails the letterboxes. Jack was making what used to be known as a first confession, but is now a group experience called the Sacrament of Reconciliation. After a talk from the pulpit, the pastor went into the sanctuary, followed in turn by each child who would sit beside him there and talk. Meanwhile, parents went to nearby confessionals where assistant pastors were waiting for them. I stood in line, went inside the box, knelt down, and repeated the usual words up to, "It has been 16 years. It has been 16 years. God, it has been 16 years. My head, God, it has been 16 years. In dots, God, 16 years. Head, clouds, to a new part. Nate, having no pat, as the nuclear mat in a box. M's and W's look the same. God is a made-up name. The dots move out."
Let's start with the first part first. So why would a poet include press reports? And I guess very quickly we're going to get to why Tina decided to do press reports around a certain issue that was happening in 1999. Who wants to start with this? Joan, why would Tina include press clippings like this?
Well, they're not just any press clippings. They're clippings that have to do with organizations that are dedicated to, in one way or another, making something that makes sense of this crazy world we live in. And they seem to me to have a bit of a kind of optimistic development in a way with the care, to the rainforest, to animal welfare, but also caring about Teamsters and steel workers and machinists and the whole movement of unions, and which Tina's wonderful poet husband, P. Inman, really took as his life's work. So there's a lot in here that's very personal for both Tina and Pete.
Interesting. So, Erica, Simone, let's talk about the form of these. The word wire here refers to, wire, press service, wire, over the wire. What are some of the formal aspects of this?
Well, if you were able to see the poem on the page, you would see in italics the name of the wire services, including Interpress Service and Associated Press and Associated Presses. Again, And so there's this sense that there's a heading, which is the actual title of the wire service, and then there's an internal structure of the poem, which is that it looks at the lead of the wire itself and then summarizes the body of the report. So it's kind of a box. It's a nested box in a way.
Mm-hmm. Erica?
Yeah, I feel like Simone covered it pretty thoroughly. I would just add that there's a dating, and then for the Associated Press, there's whether it's the PM or AM news cycle.
And there's also a kind of upside-down triangle because it begins to become more focused on locality as it begins with the Interpress service and a New York Times piece and then goes closer to the state and local wires, which then focus on Washington and Seattle.
So I don't want to go to the second half yet, but I do want to introduce just this because Tina's done a juxtaposition of her own, of two pieces written at different times. We're going to have to sort of try to understand how the juxtaposition works. But the title of the first section written earlier is Wire Boxes. And although Simone used the word box to refer to some adjacent thinking about the way these wire services work, that's not a natural thing to think first. Wire boxes makes me think of a modern sculpture or a Calder or and the wire box phrase goes back to the earlier writing. The second piece, which we'll get to in a minute, is letter boxes, which has several meanings. Let's work with wire boxes. Am I wrong? And I should have mentioned that, of course, when we get to the second part of the poem, we have actual boxes, which is something that Joan Retallack cares about as well in some of her poetry. So what do we do with this, Joan? Wire boxes, such an interesting way to deal with this WTO crisis thing. Where do boxes come from?
Well, I think that Simone really makes us see that each one of these wire announcements and so on really have a box-like quality. But I think it's perhaps most interesting when you begin with the second part of the poem with letter boxes, but also the box that is the confessional, which is actually literally, a wooden elongated box that's divided in two parts, like this poem is divided into two parts, and with a wire screen in between the confessor and the person making the confession. So Tina is so attuned to geometry, to, the beauty of very simple geometry, and bringing the two kinds of boxes together with that, the wire, with the wire that means the wire that is being sent across the wires. But also, for me, it really, I really cannot see a way of not knowing that this box that her son is going into to make the confession is, which is problematic for her on some levels, as we find out, is just as important as a kind of box.
So we have the explicit political journalism of related topics of 1999, and then we have a personal story. You're stipulating that Jack is the son of the speaker,
yes,
which is fair enough, and the speaker decides to go into the confessional. I stood in line, went inside the box, and
there's another box, which is not necessarily identified as a square box, but the shrimp And the turtles are also being caught in
Actually,
nets.
that's a wire box.
The wire box.
That is a wire box. So why would the
yes.
WTO, the World Trade Organization, reverse a decision about the law, which presumably would help
Would protect sea turtles.
protect sea turtles, but presumably it's not great for fishermen to... Anyway, let's just stipulate. Let's just say why.
Can we just go on with the boxes for 2 seconds?
Okay, please.
Okay. So,
Can we get back to the...
Yeah.
the boxes that the turtles are getting caught in.
because this is, I think, an answer to
Okay,
your
good.
question. So if you could imagine that there is a sort of net or box in which the creatures are being corralled in, and that there would need to be a kind of multiple escape routes, right? One that was small enough for a shrimp and one that was big enough for a sea turtle. So you would lose some shrimp in a space that was large enough for a sea turtle to get out of, and therefore would hurt the shrimp industry, right? So, but it's also an amazing visual to imagine that there are these multiple holes inside the wire boxes, some big and some small, and it does make one again think of Jack going into the box and also the parent going into the box.
And it also, I could be wrong here, but it's also reminding me of those wire structures that you can wrap around plants or trees that are kind of tilting in order to set them right, so to speak. Something that Darragh cares a lot about is living creatures of all kinds. So it feels like these different renderings of the visual structure of what a wire box must be feels really central to, I think, what Joan was saying about the poem's optimism. So there's a way in which, at least initially, it's a problem that the WTO dispute panel rules against U.S. law requiring all shrimp sold, et cetera, because that's a moment where a wire box that has a certain amount of escape devices is something that's actually a necessity to help creatures. And then, the wire box kind of then begins to devolve into a structure that's a lot more damaging.
The confession in the second poem has been renamed, but is now a group experience. So there's been some kind of liberalization of the confession in this community. And it's now known as the Sacrament of Reconciliation, which has a better resonance with the politics, the radical politics of the first half, than simply first confession. Can we do something with the reconciliation, the Sacrament of Reconciliation? And does it have anything to do with the actual boxes that are drawn? One has God inside it. Several others are empty. And another one has, in the frame, my head in dots. Who wants to get started on this?
Well, I think the phrase Sacrament of Reconciliation is a beautiful one. And it actually can detach itself from a particular religion. I mean, it is actually the pulpit, which is another kind of, it's sort of like standing on a box, really strikes me as contributing to the material structure that is holding all of these values and approaches to what we care about in our lives as being actually sort of comically, having to do with all of these little boxes that we all get in or put other species in. So Tina's mind is so wonderful in her sense of having really an instant and then developing way of thinking about things that don't necessarily go together.
I just love that the sacrament of reconciliation comes after the interruption of the bomb threat in the previous poem. And I wonder about the lag in time and the ultimate decision to have these poems sort of, I don't know how to say it, to amplify one another or something, and whether they in fact don't begin with the sacrament of at least the joining of the poems begins.
That is the reconciliation.
Yes.
I love that idea,
yeah.
Simone. I'm going to guess, we can ask Tina this, she's planning a set for the line reading series, thinks about letterboxes, the later piece, remembers wire boxes, basically cuts and pastes and produces this poem that only exists as a performance that night as two parts. And we've done all this scrambling to figure out, where the two originated. And we are going to have an hour-long discussion about this reconciliation of these parts. I'm just fascinated by this, what we've done here, partly. Let's go back to that last piece. It's the November 30th, 1999 Associated Press. It's a little odder than the others. The others are straightforward because the lead is this slightly condescending thing when Seattle or another city full of radicals decides everybody convenes downtown. It's a street bazaar, ha-ha, aren't they sweet, of social issues and the police in riot gear. And the body is not anticipated by the lead. The body is this grim, I would say, sort of reactive or conservative response to the there, isn't it nice how all these hippies gather together around the various issues. Can anybody make sense of that? It doesn't seem, I looked in vain using web searches for this particular story, and I didn't find it. I'm not saying Tina made it up, but it's reversing the lead and body in an interesting way. Any thoughts on that?
I did a similar investigation and had similarly no luck. But the thing that I keep coming back to is how not only is there this reversal between the body and the lead, but this body, a 5 a.m. investigation of a bomb scare at the convention center, curtails the. So that line, which is the last line of the wire boxes section, is in itself curtailed. So it's sort of a cementing of the box, so to speak, and it happens mid-sentence. So the body in the prior segments were almost self-contained little summary paragraphs, and here it's curtailed, it's cut off mid-phrase.
Either that, Erica, or sorry to interrupt, either that or it leads us to letterboxes.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Yep. And then you jump down to letterboxes.
Which is a story about a family doing the first confessional, and the parents are shuttled off to their own confessions, which presumably the speaker poet wasn't quite prepared for. Assistant pastors were waiting for them. Then Tina or the speaker realizes the first thing you have to say is, how long has it been since you confessed? It's been 16 years. So let's see if we can keep the juxtaposition going. And what is she confessing? This speaker, exactly. We don't know, do we?
Well, she's already confessed that it's been 16 years. And in Catholicism, that is a confession in itself.
Is it Catholicism, by the way? Because there's a pastor rather than priest mentioned. And there's this liberal phrase, sacrament of reconciliation. Does anybody know Catholicism well enough to know whether this is actually Catholicism?
Well, I think it is Catholicism. And Catholicism has gone through various shifts in vocabulary. So I don't think that is anything that would be problematic to associate with the stalwart Catholic Church. I think that really works. It goes into, again, a kind of humor that is on just the right level for what the two sections are about. In both cases, there's a lot of gravity that's engaged in the the text, but also that one can just guess for with a family that's been away from the church and then is really having a need for one reason or another to introduce their child, their son, to that particular tradition. And it happens in many different religions, all of which, by the way, I think involve boxes,
Absolutely.
finding yourself in various boxes. So I think it actually is something that moves out into a larger scope as you go. And then as you notice, Al, leads to it has been 16 years, which is
In the performance, she repeats
is what
that.
it's yes, and it is actually a kind of performance. Even in a real life confession, those are the words you're supposed to make or present. How long it's been, you have to.
It's bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been X since my last confession.
Right.
Isn't that how-
Yeah.
I wonder if
Yeah.
Paul and Zach will play that part of the performance at the line reading series, because she really does more than what's produced in the Mutant Solidarities version,
Yeah.
which we will reproduce with the show notes so that people can actually see
Great.
it.
Letterboxes. Jack was making what used to be known as a first confession, but is now a group experience called the Sacrament of Reconciliation. After a talk from the pulpit, the pastor went into the sanctuary, followed in turn by each child who would sit beside him there and talk. Meanwhile, parents went to nearby confessionals where assistant pastors were waiting for them. I stood in line, went inside the box, knelt down, and repeated the usual words up to, "It has been 16 years. It has been 16 years. God, it has been 16 years. My head, God, it has been 16 years. In dots, God, 16 years. Head, clouds, to a new part. Nate, having no pad, as the nuclear mat in a box. M's and W's look the same. God is a made-up name. The dots move out."
So let's talk about the performance, but then let's try to understand what's actually being said semantically there. Clouds, two of no part. Nate seems to be a proper name, though not capitalized, having no pat, and a reference to nuclear mat. So first the performance, then the words. What did you hear, Erica?
I heard a performance of the physical form that the text takes on the page, which I know that listeners can't see what we're looking at, but the poem has a series of drawn rectangles and boxes, and there are moments where Tina is actually saying things that don't appear in the text as words, but they seem to be echoing the structures that the text is living inside that have been drawn on. So an example of that is my head, and then I think in the recording she says in a box or in box, and then God comes in an extra time too, I think. I think she says, God, it has been 16 years, God. Again, so there are these moments where words are returning as if they're the being spoken out loud of the actual drawn text.
And what are the dots, anyone? What are the dots referred to?
I love that the dots are a kind of fog, first of all. They're like being in a sort of confused reverie as to, wondering what it is that one's doing inside this box. And then the dots also represent concrete thoughts, I think. That then once, there's a lot happening in this dramatization, but it seems like one is always in a state of confusion and fog, which are represented on the page with these tiny dots, unformed thoughts and materials. And, of course, they move out once this so-called reconciliation with the question of God seems to
They move
have
out of the
occurred.
box.
They move out of that
Because what we're
head.
seeing,
Yeah.
and again, we'll reproduce this for the show notes, we're seeing a little indication of the box with dots in it. The dots inside the box move out. And I keep thinking of dot matrix because actually the font here is an old early Mac Apple font. It is a dot matrix print.
Yeah.
And therefore, this is the way in which the M's and W's actually look the same in that font.
Yeah. And Al, it's interesting because the version you're looking at is the one from 89. And when this section gets republished in 2020, there isn't the box around the dots. The dots are just hanging out on their own outside of a box.
Yeah.
And there's also the word God isn't in quotation marks, and it's in a much smaller box. It's not in this giant rectangle. So it's interesting to think about how a poem adapts to the life it lives. You know, like if we understand the letterboxes section to have been published much earlier and then published again in 2020, there's a way in which the poem continues to live by way of performance, as we know from the recording, but also by way of the ways in which it's revised for publication.
So let's see if we can get this right. In 89, we have the confessional. The kid goes to confession, and the speaker is sort of drawn into this. In 99, we have a kind of a documentary poetics. In 2001, she puts them together for the first time. Then she publishes a new book which reproduces the early piece, and then in 2023, we put the two back together. So this poem both lives in its separateness, the boxes, or Tina Darragh, the poet, has been thinking about them together, but they can stay separate. So what happens to the poem? It's one thing to put them together and declare that's the juxtaposition that will always be the meaning. It's another for them to allow to be separate and come together and separate. Help me out here. What's going on? This is a little unusual, probably to poetry readers, to have this kind of juxtaposition. And clearly the second gets politicized by the first. How? And are they necessarily connected?
Well, I don't see anything problematic about this at all. I mean, walking through life, it's one improbable, in quotes, mixture after another. And these are two parts of actually this family's life. The first part and the second part are, in both cases, they are problematic. And the writer-reader is trying to navigate that with language. I mean, just to make some kind of structured language that allows us to not get completely sunk in either one of them in a way that is not only not resolvable, which of course we know is the case, and thank goodness there's no forced resolution, but I find something happening toward the end of this that is in her voice in the recording that we're listening to, and then is also in some of the changes that she's made, but remains as a kind of core thing.
Simone, what are you thinking?
I was just thinking about the exclamatory nature, the way that God is used in the performance as an exclamation rather than a religious name, which is then said, is made up. And so the sort of double and the repetition of it in the performance so that it's like it becomes an epithet to a certain degree. It's an exclamation. God, how is this possible? And then God, the denial of God also in that moment. It's really incredible.
Though, I do want to say one thing. I don't think saying that God is a made-up name necessarily puts God aside as it. There are so many different words for God, and they're all made-up names. Mm-hmm. And if you took them all away, and you had religious beliefs or intuitions or feelings, however you want to, it wouldn't matter that these are made-up names, because you know that the essence of whatever is called God is something that is beyond a name.
I think that's exactly my feeling. I think that the poem for me is both of these poems together become about the different relationship to God over a period of time. For me, that's how I read them together. Mm-hmm. And I, by the way, have zero religious sentiment, but that's what I begin to feel as I sort of...
To me, it may be that I've just been reading Joan Retallack for 5 weeks straight.
Uh-oh.
This is a good thing, Joan. To me, because of that, the key phrase in this poem is repeated the usual words, which is an indication of, in this case, a kind of religious ideology, a ritual where you're supposed to say certain things. This follows this cadre of assistant pastors waiting for the parents to take them in. So it's institutionalized. She didn't quite realize this was going to happen, but she went along. And we've just followed a certain kind of rhetorical, journalistic institutionalization, the coverage of this just world-ending bullshit, that happens. Rules that are made and then ignored. Then people react, and the journalism does its usual thing of reacting to people who are feeling rather desperate about the situation. Repeating the usual words. Joan Retallack, you have written so many times that ideology, which is going to cause the repeating of the usual words, is the thing that we have to be most guarded against. And then Tina has this rhetorical ecstasy, or this lexicographical ecstasy, which has a kind of surprising, cloudy, dot-y explosion to it, which is what we're just saying. So she says the usual words, then begins to repeat them, and goes way beyond the ritual and gives us a poem, a theological, political juxtaposition that's unanticipated, and causes us to have this conversation, which is the opposite of repeating the usual words, because we entered this room having no clue as to what we would say. This is what poetry can do, I think. So thank you, Joan Retallack. Did that make sense? Let's get some final thoughts. Anything that you wanted to say.
Final thoughts already? Oh,
well,
wow.
We don't have to be. Let's go around twice. Let's add some new things. I'm still interested in the wire boxes, letter boxes, parallel. There's so many things to talk about. Let's start with Erica, who's been pondering lately.
I wonder if the content of the wire boxes could actually be determined depending on the moment when one is about to read the poem. In other words, is that first poem in itself a kind of model of a procedure where, you can, given the world that we currently live in, you can follow the structure of looking at, news wires, press reports, clippings, and then from whatever time we're living in, and then juxtapose that against the letterboxes poem, and I think it would have a similarly strong effect. So that's one thing that I'm kind of mulling over, is whether or not that's part of the reason why wire boxes doesn't exist in physical written down form. The other thing that I'm thinking a lot about is the shift in the last 3 lines. In a box, M's and W's look the same. God is a made-up name. So we get the explosiveness of the prior part of the poem, and then it dips into the sing-songy territory. And that creates another shift for me, where I'm wondering, if it is ecstasy or if it is more of a giant question or puzzle. The it being the part that comes right before in letterboxes.
I just hearing what you've been saying have new sense of the very last line. The dots move out and that I think that's rather beautiful in the way it is not trying to say anything more specific, but this actually is what has to happen, or it's somehow so perfect for the end of this poem that the dots move out. Now,
move out is such a organized protest march word.
Yeah, actually, that's beautiful. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. Yes, and therefore, you no longer have dots. You can say they move out because we've got what is actually the case that we can't deny in this language.
Can I say something that may throw off Simone, who was about to say something? I'm sorry. I apologize in advance.
But I'm not sure
yeah.
what I was going to say.
So 99 in Seattle is a moment where neo-anarchism returns. I guess I just made a redundancy there. Neo-anarchism arises as part of the contemporary movement, particularly the Green Movement, which had been so organized, almost like the assistant pastors, I mean, that's not quite right, but, more like the assistant pastors helping you to the boxes for confession. And then lately, from 99 forward, less like that. And it seems that anarchy is the dots moving out. I meant not anarchy, but anarchism, as in, anarcho-pacifism and so forth. Just a thought. I don't know where that goes, but I think that the juxtaposition really makes the earlier poem stand out as I think of the anarcho-pacifism of someone like Jackson McClough, the kind of McClovian, the sweet anarcho-pacifism that hopes for, confession would never be a word that McClough would use, but the stating of the inner truth, but it's not in a non-ritualized way, but in a communally organized way.
Yeah.
I love to think of these boxes. So the boxes with the dots in them, and then the emptying of the boxes as the dots move out, seems to me to be a clearing. And a clearing of both the mind, if the mind is that as a kind of box that contains these dots. So the mind certainly becomes clear at the end of the poem, but also in the earlier poem with respect to the sort of anarcho-pacifism, or if that's the term that we're using, is a different vision of justice too. So that, if we're reading them together as a poem that has so much to do with justice and whose orders of justice are going to organize, whose boxes are they, like this beautiful opening is what occurs at the end of the poem, in the same way that, in a way, the blast of violence that happens at the end, or the threatened blast of violence at the end of the...
What gets curtailed? I mean, we've said the letterboxes of the next poem, but in the context of that report on November 30th, 5 a.m. investigation, presumably by the police, of a bomb scare curtails the what? The right to march, the freedoms of the people who were protesting. It's, this is what we're made to think. The police are there around the bazaar in riot gear. Then we have a bomb scare, not a bomb, but a bomb scare. And the police, this is a typical thing, right? The police are then affirmed in their having set up for riot. even though it's a bazaar of a lot of people with selling their political wares and using Seattle as a place to be, people traveling from a long way. And then the police set up, and then the bomb scare happens, and then what gets curtailed is the bazaar.
Well, we're in a post-2020 world now. It's very difficult to think of those gatherings as feel-good, sort of post.
Well, the way they're pitched by the
yes, of
journalists.
course, yeah. But retrospectively, sort of thinking about these gatherings in the street and what clearance of them means is hard, to think now.
It is hard to go back to the previous
Yeah.
boxes. Erica, final thought?
It's interesting that the comment that I was talking about earlier about the enactment of what's on the page, I got some of the repetition wrong, and it's even more intense than I'd realized. There's a repetition that doesn't exist in writing of it has been 16 years, my head, God, and then there's also an in dots, God, it has been 16 years. So it really lifts the poem right up off the page in a way that each time you listen to it becomes more and more intense. So I guess my final thought is that we should all listen to this poem many, many times.
And you called it a poem, a single piece, even though it was written as two separate. Joan, final thought?
Well, I completely agree with what Erica just said, and I'm eager to listen to this again. I don't see any problem at all in calling it a poem. That it's, and I happen to love poems that have different kinds of logics going on, up against each other in various ways. So I think it's a wonderful poem.
I love how you said you happen to like doing this, and you do it yourself. You're a poet who cares about the work that had appeared in various books in various places and thinking about them together, and it is a great way to read your work as it is to read Tina's. And there maybe, other than the advocacy of Tina Darragh's poetry, which is the implicit in just doing this PoemTalk on her, there is this relationship that you have to the way this works that is, aesthetic and personal and
yes, and relationship to Tina as someone I have esteemed so highly for so long, and I've learned so much from her. We go back well over 30 years, maybe 40.
Your fellow community member in the D.C. circle of poets, among many others.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Simone White, final thought?
I wanted to import a line from another part of this book, which I'm so glad that Erica introduced me to, Against the Odds, which is this line, all I've been through, which also exists in a box, all in one box, and I've been through in another box, squished together, but not on top of each other. So there's just something about the form that comes together in this book and in these two poems about how to write that the box is resolving for us as a form of how to contain experience.
For my final thought, I want to say something about poetry readings or recordings of poetry readings. If you're not careful, so this reading was segmented by a member of the Pen Sound staff. So we have the whole reading, which one can listen to, so the entire set in its order. And then we have, on the Tina Darragh page at Pen Sound, we have the segmentation, poem by poem. Whoever did the segmentation, often a junior member of the team, a student, knew enough that curtails the dash, then not much of a pause, then the statement of the next title, and it resonated with the previous title. So this smart and intuitive editor knew that this was not two poems. It could easily have been segmented into two poems. It has been listed. We found it there when we decided to talk about this poem as a single performance. And then we did all the textual criticism and the bibliographical work to get to understand that they're separated by time and then joined together in this one moment. I just wanted to advocate for our careful reading of the spaces between poems as read at a performance. Because I'm a Pen Sound co-director, so I listen to dozens and dozens and hundreds of readings, and sometimes the poet moves quickly to the next poem such that it sounds like it's a series or a serial poem or of a piece. The juxtaposition is legit and intended. Sometimes they leave a big space but intend for the juxtaposition to take place. This is the beauty of readings, of poetry readings. And we have to read them this way, the way we've done this one. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow hands, our narrow Dickinsonian hands, to gather a little something poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the prose world or the film world or the music world. Simone, you're sitting back, but I know you have one.
I do have one. I was explaining that a book had come into my hands lately called Accidental Gods by Anna Della Subin, which is about human beings who, through various accidents and colonial misadventures, become deified. And it's one of the only books that I've sought out that I was not required to read because of my own, what do you call it? Critical writing lately. So there's a chapter on Haile Selassie, which is kind of an abiding interest of mine. So I'm excited to.
Who was deified.
Who was deified, yes. Against his will.
It's an interesting situation. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Say the name of the book again.
Accidental Gods.
Fantastic. Erica, Gather Some Paradise.
I have been reading a fantastic new book by the wonderful Anne Waldman called Bard Kinetic. And
what a great Waldman title that is.
It is so good. It's a combination of memoir-type short essays and poems and spans an amazing quantity of time. And it feels like a uniquely epic, stunning undertaking.
Wonderful. And the title again is?
Bard Kinetic, Anne Waldman.
Love it. Joan Retallack, Gather Some Paradise, please.
I want to highly recommend Tina Darragh's most recent publication, which is My Hand to Mutant Solidarities. And the title really gives a very true sense of this being a fascinating book that has a lot going on in conversations that are completely improbable with one to another. And I recommend it highly. At the same time, it's hard to get right now, but you need to order it through Peter Inman. So
we will post if
can you do that?
If Peter is good with it, we'll post it to the show notes here on Jacket 2.
I'll find out when I get back.
I'm looking at the book now, and it's not apparent how you can get a copy, but I'm sure you can.
I know that there's no way to get it right now except through Peter.
We will make that clear in the show notes. My Hands to Mutant Solidarities.
Yeah, I mean, just the title, we could spend probably a whole poem talk on.
Not to mention the anatomical drawing of an elephant.
Right,
on the front cover.
Right.
It's quite an amazing thing. Well, my paradise is sitting in the room. It's Joan Retallack, who is now, let's just say, has been here with us for several days and is finishing up a turn as Writers House Fellow. We're so happy about that. And the newest book is Boscht, Bosch, apostrophe-D, Boscht, and it is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous book put out by Litmus. And I just wanted to read a 4-line poem that appears near the end in a section called In Loco Post Scriptum afterwards. And this poem is called Exhaustion. The exhaustion of truth in language was so great, there was no way to know what one had to go on as one had to go on going on. And I am not exhausted reading that poem. I am excited and energized by that. Thank you, Joan. Well, that's all the kneeling down inside a box we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writer's House is a collaboration. Should I do a different one?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that didn't work. All right.
No,
I can't
it
quite
spectacularly didn't work.
Okay, let's try it again. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's all the street bazaar of social issues we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writer's House.
He's going off the rails.
Did I fail again? Did I fail again? I don't have much left. All right.
That might be the best sign. Go by that.
So,
Nothing left.
Wait, I can't do street bazaar of social issues. Well, that's all the sea turtle escape devices we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writer's House. I can't control these people. It's a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, Penn Sound, and the Kelly Writer's House at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much to my guests, Erica Kaufman. We're giddy. We're crazy. Simone White and Joan Retallack. And to PoemTalk's director and engineer today, Zach Gardner and Paul Burke. And to PoemTalk's editor, who has a hell of a job ahead of him. The same amazing Zach Gardner. Next time on PoemTalk, I'll be talking with Maya Pindick, Lainey Brown, and Hua Wen for a discussion of the love songs of Mina Loy. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of PoemTalk.
The Sea Turtles is